Good evening, everyone. I am Joe Hensley, Rector, Lead Minister of St. George's Episcopal Church, and I welcome you to our lecture tonight, really the first event in our 300th anniversary lecture series. I see a note in the chat that says, "Are we online?" And the answer is yes, we are online. I am again Joe Hensley, and would like to just express my joy that we are beginning our 300th anniversary, even though we have been unable to do a lot of the events that we wanted to when we wanted to. We postponed a lot of the events until next year. But this lecture tonight, featuring Professor David Marsich, seemed like one we could do using Zoom technology. So we're glad to welcome all of you here tonight. Let me just give a few words of instruction and introduction, and then I will turn it over to Peter Rasmussen, who's been coordinating our lecture series for the 300th anniversary. As you may or may not know, in 1720, the House of Burgesses of the colony of Virginia passed legislation creating the Parish of St. George's, which was a region that was called St. George's, and it when it was started had a number of different congregations in it, and eventually those became centered in what became downtown Fredericksburg. So 1720 is sort of one of the years that is celebrated as the beginning of the St. George's worshiping community. The legislation went into effect on May 1st, 1721. And so we have decided to celebrate our 300th anniversary as a parish in 2020 and 2021. So welcome to our first event. I'd like to thank Marilyn Farrington and Lisa Durham, who are the co-chairs of our 300th anniversary committee. And I'd like to thank Peter Rasmussen, whom I'll introduce in a moment, who has been coordinating our lecture series. And tonight's, this series is all about history. And so I also want to thank Cindy Helton and the members of our St. George's History Committee who've been hard at work. Our goal in the 300th anniversary is to is partially to tell our history, to tell our whole story. And that includes the works of faith and hope and love of the good works of generations before us, while at the same time being honest that sometimes faith was used as justification for works that were the opposite of love. And so we want to tell not only the story of the people who were involved in St. George's, but the lives of those that they touched. And tonight's lecture about the context of St. George's, about the history of the church in colonial times, will touch not only on the history of church members, but upon the people whose lives they touched, including those of enslaved persons. And so we are here to celebrate history. We are here to learn from history. And we are here to look into the future to see where is God calling us to go as we wrap up 300 years, where do we go from here? And so it's fitting that we would start our celebration with some looking back into the history, and we hope that you'll have a chance to ask some questions and post some comments. So because this is a webinar, you can't see each other, you can see the panelists, but you can participate by posting questions in the Zoom webinar chat, which should, if you can't see the chat, down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little bar, a little toolbar, and you'll see a chat word and a word cloud, and you click on that, and there should be a little sidebar that pops up on the right-hand side, and down at the bottom you can type a message that will be seen by the panelists, and you can also click on to see something that would be clicked on panelists and attendees, and we'll be watching that for questions and comments throughout the evening. I'd like to thank the Reverend Will Dickinson, who is our acting associate rector at St. George's, while our associate rector Rita is on maternity leave, and Will is running the technical show for us this evening. Thank you, Will. Also, you'll see in the chat bar a link to our 300th anniversary celebration page for more information, as well as a link to our donation page. We would appreciate your support, donations that will help us to put on the events of our 300th anniversary. So if you click on that link, it'll take you to the donation page, and you just select, you'll have a number of different options of where to donate. Select 300th anniversary lectures to make that donation. And we appreciate your generosity. And as we are hoping to generously share this event with the entire Fredericksburg area community. After all, St. George's Parish encompassed our whole region at its inception. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter, but first I'd like to offer a word of opening prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for the gift of the church, which brings us and binds us together in faith. We thank you for the good example of the saints who have gone before us, for their faith, for their good works, for their love. We also give thanks for the ways in which their witness inspires us to bear witness to your love in the world. Gracious God, we also ask that you would help us to remember the times when your church fell short of your calling. Help us to learn from the past, that as we go into the future, inspired by your grace, we may be a people that respects the dignity of every human being, that loves our neighbors as ourselves, that seeks to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Bless this lecture tonight, bless this time. May our eyes be opened and our hearts be opened to your presence with us. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So Peter Rasmussen is a member of St. George's. He's a lover of history. He jokes that he is a amateur historian, and that his daily work has him, in his own words, in toiling away in the dark arts of the law. But we are so thankful that he is embracing his calling as an amateur historian and has arranged for us this lecture tonight. So Peter, we thank you so much for your work and invite you to go ahead and introduce our guest.
Thanks, Joe. It's a very exciting evening, and welcome everyone. As Joe mentioned, I've been working with the 300th Anniversary Committee, and we are fortunate to have David Marsich with us, Assistant Professor of History at Germanna Community College. And I really want to thank David for answering it was a cold call. He didn't know me at all. I might as well have been trying to sell him magazine subscriptions, but he graciously agreed to join us tonight. In addition to his teaching load, he is working on his PhD at George Mason with a long resume of experience as a historian, both academically, and he has also worked at many historical sites interpreting history, including Yorktown, Jamestown, and the Shaker Village settlement in Kentucky. His undergraduate degree is from St. Mary's College in Maryland, and he earned his master's degree at the University of Kentucky. And we are thrilled to have him. And David, thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to go ahead and start setting up the screen share. I, in turn, want to thank you, Peter, for reaching out to me and working with me. I'd like to thank the 300th Anniversary Committee at St. George's for this opportunity, as well as thank the rectors of your church Reverend Joe Hensley and Will Dickinson. And finally, thank you to all of you who have gathered this evening to join us. I was joking earlier that a good history nerd loves nothing more than having a captive audience for an hour to talk about history. So you've made me very happy in that. So I'd like really just to sort of talk about the religious culture of Virginia, particularly in the 18th century, with the goal of trying to put St. George's Parish into context. In 1724, Reverend Hugh Jones, a minister of the Church of England who had served a 2-year stint as a professor of mathematics at William and Mary, wrote, "If New England be called a receptacle of dissenters and an Amsterdam of religion, Pennsylvania the nursery of Quakers, Maryland the retirement of Roman Catholics, North Carolina the refuge of runaways, and South Carolina the delight of buccaneers and pirates, Virginia may be justly esteemed the happy retreat of true Britons and true churchmen for the most part, neither soaring too high nor drooping too low, consequently should merit the greater esteem and encouragement." While we ought to take his observations of each colony with a grain of salt, he does draw attention to the diversity of British America in the 18th century. Each colony had its own religious culture, even as they were bound by custom, law, and trade to an increasingly Protestant Great Britain. The monarch who ruled Britain was also the head of the Church of England, a national church that had evolved over 2 centuries to create space for everyone, from high church Anglicans to Puritan reformers. The men and women who settled in British America thus brought with them ideas about religion and faith, even as they sought to remake the Americas into something more British. What is more, the people that they enslaved from Africa and the native peoples they encountered on the coast of North America also had faiths of different traditions. It is not an exaggeration to say that the religious beliefs of settler and native, master and slave informed how each saw the other and the course of early American history. I joke with my students that my courses are about, in part, the things that their mothers told them to never discuss in polite company, religion and politics. Yet political ideology and religious beliefs inform much of how we see the world and our vision of what we believe the world should be. The way we see our own past informs our sense of national identity, of who we are as a people. What is the role that religion plays in that identity? Was America born as a Christian nation? To what extent did ideas of religious freedom inform the founding of the colonies or the founding of the Republic? These are big questions, and I do not pretend to be able to wholly answer them in about an hour's time, but I do hope to approach them in a humble way by talking about the worlds that your parish, St. George's, was a part of. I do not mean here to provide a detailed architectural history of your beautiful church building, nor is this a chronicle of its rectors or the finer points of 18th century Anglican theology. Instead, I mean to paint you a picture of Virginia's religious culture to help put your church into context so that you can better see the world it was a part of. I mean especially to highlight what it meant to have a religious establishment in Virginia, but also to show that Anglicanism and Christianity more largely adapted as it moved across the Atlantic. I also hope to show you that as part of this establishment, the church in Virginia was deeply connected in most aspects of society, including the creation and extension of slavery. Finally, I hope to show that rather than being unchanging, the religious culture and the establishment changed with time. The American Revolution, even as it brought political independence, was a powerful engine for social and religious change within Virginia. The term itself, establishment, is significant for understanding the role that the Church of England played in Virginia and in other British colonies. In its early sessions, 100 years before Reverend Jones published his account, the General Assembly had recognized the Church of England as the official church of Virginia. There was no separation of church and state, and in many respects, it is difficult to disentangle the church and the state in colonial Virginia in terms of some of their public functions. While the stories we often tell of colonial religion often focus on revivals, often focus on dissenters, like Anne Hutchinson, right, like Roger Williams, who cast themselves against the establishment, it is vital that we recognize that the Anglican Church in Virginia played an important role not only in the spiritual lives of colonists, but also in the public realm. What did establishment look like? Well, perhaps most immediately, it meant that the Anglican Church in Virginia was supported by an assessment or a tax. Households paid this tax per tithable. That term refers to people who were potentially part of a productive workforce. In other words, those people whose labor produced wealth were tithable. By law, white and black men over 16 years of age were tithable, as well as black women. White women whose labor was seen as domestic, as not producing a profit, as producing wealth, right? Here in contrast to black women who were by and large enslaved and thus working in what were seen as masculine sort of areas outside. White women were as a result not tithable. Freeholders, men who owned their own land, were responsible for paying not only the levy, the tax, on their own families, but also on their servants and slaves. On average, the annual parish levy per tithable was 35 pounds of tobacco. Do not worry, this is not a paper full of numbers. There are a few numbers, and this is roughly half of them. Average annual levy per tithable, 35 pounds of tobacco. This was usually the largest tax paid by freeholders, taxpayers, in the colony. The second highest, a levy for the county, averaged only about 14 pounds of tobacco per tithable. While the amounts varied by region and over time, the parish levy was usually about twice that of the county tax. We know that the taxpayers of St. George's Parish shouldered this burden as well. In 1732 and in 1733, they paid more than 100 pounds of tobacco per tithable. And in the decade that followed, the average was 81 pounds per tithable, an average 60% higher than the rest of the colony. The levy varied yearly based on the needs of the parish. Are you building a new church building? Right? Has there been a recent influx of people who need help? But the size of the parish assessment compared to the county gives us a sense of how large the parish loomed in the lives of early Virginians. It is important to note that this was not a tax imposed by the royal government in England, nor decreed by a distant archbishop. Those looking for early evidence of British tyranny via taxation will be disappointed. Rather, these were levies decided upon at the local level. The General Assembly, made up of elected representatives from the counties, set the pay rate for clergy and likewise mandated that each parish would provide glebe lands, real estate, property, with which the minister, the parson, could support himself. That the General Assembly also insisted that the parish was responsible for erecting buildings for worship and for providing for the poor. But it was the vestries and the local county governments, it was for them to then raise these funds through taxes, to set those levy rates, and to essentially fulfill those obligations. In short, at the local level, free Virginians supported their church establishment with their purses. A large part of those taxes helped fund what was known as poor relief, a term that captures some of the extensive role that the parish played in ensuring the welfare of its parishioners. In colonial Virginia, as in England at the time, the community had a responsibility to care for those who could not care for themselves. While today a mixture of public programs administered by the government and private religious and secular charities seek to provide a social safety net, in the 18th century, it fell to the parishes to provide care for those who needed it. Church wardens, a pair of vestrymen chosen in each parish to handle day-to-day affairs, sorted through gossip, through rumor, to determine who in the parish needed help, to judge the worthiness of such claims, and to ensure those needs were met. Parish records reveal thousands were spent annually to provide food and medical care, to provide stipends for households who took in needy children, and to help ensure the well-being of infirm adults. What you see on the screen here is taken from a study of Anglican parishes, and it gives you just a snapshot of some of the ways that poor relief worked in Lynnhaven Parish, kind of around the beginning of the French and Indian War. What you see right, of course, to the left is an entry for the individual, and then sort of the expenditure that the parish was putting in every year for that effort. Parishes also took on the responsibility of placing orphans and illegitimate children with families as servants or apprentices. And you see quite a lot of that in this source here, right? To Mr. John Keeley for keeping Benjamin Burroughs, right? For keeping Duncan King's child, etc. Such children would lend their labor to the adopted families or masters, and in return, they would be boarded and hopefully gain a skill that would help support them later in life. By mid-century, some parishes were spending upwards of 30% of their annual budget on poor relief, or next to the salary of their parson, right? This was one of the largest expenditures that those assessments, right, were going towards. Early Virginians recognized that the parish provided a means to care for the poor and vulnerable in society, as well as a place to worship God. I don't know if you heard that, but there was just a peal of thunder. And their relative willingness to submit to taxes and otherwise support this function reminds us of how integral the established church was. We also see the religious establishment in the laws of colonial Virginia. It bears repeating that the Anglican Church enjoyed a privileged place in the law, in the legal code of the colony. Church attendance was mandated by law. Parishioners read every resident of the parish, so everyone needed to attend on a regular basis. The frequency of this attendance varied depending on the year, but just to give you an example, before 1744, people had to attend church once every 8 weeks, and afterwards it was once every 4 weeks. The law also insisted that Anglican ministers held the exclusive right to conduct marriages in Virginia. So even members of a dissenting sect, Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, and so forth, would need to seek out the services of their local Anglican parson, their local Anglican clergyman. In addition, dissenters still had to pay the tax in support of their parish, even if they objected to its teachings, because it was the established church. It's the law. Religious ideas of morality, also informed the laws and the court proceedings of the colony. Yearly, county courts heard cases brought by the church wardens against individuals accused of violating codes of morality and laws regulating orderly behavior. In England, such cases would have been heard by a church court, but in Virginia, the county court heard them, underscoring how intertwined the religious establishment was with the civil one. Every month, the county court would hear charges made against residents by a grand jury involving moral offenses, profanity, blasphemy, fornication, adultery, rowdiness, and other crimes that offended English and Virginia norms. Fines collected from such proceedings were given to the church wardens to help the parish support the poor, right, of the community. And another sort of example of that is here, right? This is specifically a punishment for fornication, but you'll notice they talk about that they need to do penance, that they've been presented by the church wardens, and it sort of prescribes that, beyond a fine, right, they're going to have to essentially kind of shame themselves, right, humiliate themselves a little bit by standing in the middle of the church upon a stool, kind of dressed in a specific costume. Colonial Virginia is often contrasted against New England as a land of worldly cavaliers, as opposed to devout Puritans. Yet even in their breach, we can see how the established church informed the laws of the colony, and thus the norms of what was and was not acceptable.
I just had a quick question,
Sure.
Dave, if you don't mind. I was wondering, how do we measure this, how religious people, how religious were they in the past, in the 17th, 18th centuries?
It's a really good question, Peter, because, even today, right, I mean, faith is a deeply personal, deeply internal thing, right, for lack of a better word. Historians rely on evidence, right? I mean, as much as history is interpretive, as much as we scrutinize and draw conclusions, right, we are an evidence-based discipline. We use primary sources, right, firsthand accounts, and you've already seen a few of those from me, right? You've seen an example of a sort of a travel log published by a minister. You've seen some laws, right? You've seen some accounts from courts, and we read these sources in order to try to put the puzzle pieces together. It's really hard, I think, in some ways, to measure religious faith. Historians of religion often look at, they call it adherence, right? They look at attendance records. They look at the breach of laws, right? How many people are being fined for not coming to church, with the hope that if we understand attendance to services, to ritual, it might give us a sense of religiosity, of faith. We also can look at the writings that people have left behind. To what extent do they really use religious language, right? Are they drawing on scripture, right, as idioms and as anecdotes? Are they offering reflections? In some churches, especially in evangelical churches, people have to provide they have to witness to their conversion, right? They have to often provide sort of personal narratives of how they came to Christ and to the church. And that also, if those survive in written form, that gives us another opportunity to see it. But it is challenging, right, to measure genuine faith. We can also try to look over the shoulder of records, not just at what people say, but the actions they took. Are they prepared to suffer for their religious faith, which might give us a sense of the degree to which it was important to them rather than a convenience. But I think it's something that historians more recently have tried to recognize. Once upon a time, we often used religion in the telling of history as a screen, right? We were always looking for political or social or economic reasons behind religious behavior. But in the last couple of decades, I think historians have really tried to remember in the way they look at their subjects that for many people in the past, religion was a genuinely hopeful and important experience, and that we need to kind of write history to reflect that, while also paying attention to its social and political, sort of value. So it's hard, but maybe not impossible. As much as I want to emphasize its role as the established church, nor do I wish to convey a sense that the Anglican Church was brittle or calcified in the 18th century. Instead, scholars have shown that one of the qualities of the church was adaptation. Transplanted from Britain, the church represented a connection with the mother country. Parishioners used the same Book of Common Prayer as their British cousins. Many of the clergy were British born or at least British educated. The British monarch, right, was the head of the church on the American side of the Atlantic as much as on the European side. Yet Anglicanism adapted to the American landscape, even while maintaining those transatlantic ties, those transatlantic connections. Virginia was a rural colony. Its turn to agriculture early in its history meant that the population was dispersed across the land in farms and plantations of varying size. While your church today stands in the historic center of Fredericksburg, in the 18th century, most people would not have had such a convenient place to worship. It is not unreasonable to imagine traveling several miles to the nearest church in the 18th century. And in an era when the horse was the fastest mode of land transportation, some would have traveled hours on the Sabbath to take part in services, a substantial investment of time and a potential obstacle to participation in the religious culture. Virginians thus adapted the parish system, as it was in England, to meet this reality in Virginia by creating what scholars call open-ended multi-congregational parishes. The General Assembly established parishes much larger geographically than those found in Britain, in part to ensure that there were enough people, remember the population is dispersed, right, on farms and plantations, in part to ensure that there were enough people within the parish to financially support the parson and other parish expenses. As the colony's population grew and settlers moved west, first past the Fall Line, and then into the Piedmont, and then beyond the Blue Ridge, these parishes changed to accommodate. Parishioners and vestries petitioned the General Assembly to divide existing parishes and to create new ones as their roles increased and as the center of population changed. Thus, the bounds of parishes changed with time and were responsive to the voices of Virginians in a fashion similar to the expansion of counties and civil government at the same time. In addition, parishes were multi-congregational in that while each parish had a parson, they also tended to have several congregations spread across the parish. Typically, such parishes had a mother church and several what were called chapels of ease spread across its territory. As a result, even before the days of the archetypal itinerant Methodist minister, Anglican clergy traveled from congregation to congregation, offering services at one church on one Sunday and at another the next week. This may help explain the church attendance laws, which mandated attendance within a period of time rather than every week. Clergy were limited in number, and parishioners were widely spread across the land. The Virginia religious establishment adapted to accommodate itself to this challenge. Even lacking an ordained clergyman on a given Sunday, parishioners had access to many of the rites, prayers, and songs that helped define their liturgy. Only clergy could offer communion, preach, and offer absolution, but lay readers, often a clerk who's on the parish payroll, could be appointed to lead the divine services from the Book of Common Prayer. The laity also had access to published homilies that were pre-authorized that could be read to the congregation. In addition, parishes employed both men and women as sextons, who maintained and kept the church clean and ready for worship. In this way, the formalism of the Anglican Church was a great asset in Virginia. Parishioners had a script that they could follow on weeks when their parson was elsewhere, and in those periods when they were without a clergyman altogether. In our telling of American religious history, we often fall into the trap of casting the liturgical, established churches in the language used by the revivalists of the Great Awakening and evangelicals who challenged the authority of those established, more liturgical churches. But far from being dry or lifeless, Virginia parishes were active. While certainly the law of the land mandated a degree of participation, and not every parish resident was as pious as the next, we should not necessarily assume that because the church was established, that adherence was only pro forma, that adherence was, they're only there because it was mandatory. People's lives were marked by the rituals of the church. By baptism, by confirmation, by marriages, and even funerals. Parsons not only conducted services, but also acted as counselors in the 18th century as they do today, visiting the homes of parishioners in crisis or in need. The great size of parishes and the lack of ordained clergy meant that the laity had to take a more active role, and they did. Beyond clerks, sextons, and worshipers, perhaps the most important example of lay involvement within the church was the role of the vestry in Virginia. The Church of England never appointed a bishop in the 13 colonies, and thus there was a lack of direct episcopal oversight in America. The relatively large parishes described earlier meant that the laity played an active role in building and maintaining their parish, but it also meant that it was impractical for the entire parish to assemble at one time to discuss and deal with church business. Thus, what would have been called in Britain a select vestry, 12 men and the parson, became responsible for advancing the interests of the parish in Virginia. Unlike in Britain, Virginia vestries maintained the power to both hire and fire clergy, something that they couldn't do back in Britain. That was the sort of prerogative of the bishop. Vestries were also proactive in petitioning the provincial government when it came time to establish or subdivide parishes. The vestries were responsible for the construction and the maintenance of church buildings, caring for parishioners in need, and censuring parishioners who violated laws related to morality. In many ways, they mirrored the county court as a local institution of significance in terms of taking responsibility for the public good. Membership on the vestry appears to have been relatively stable. Freemen, those freeholders, elected the vestry at the formation of a parish, and again upon the death, relocation, or retirement of a vestryman. By and large, the vestry consisted of members of the gentry, the social and political elites of 18th century Virginia. For them, membership in the vestry was often held alongside other leadership posts in the county and provisional government and in the militia. So thus far, and kind of come back around, right? Thus far, I have tried to sketch a picture of the church in colonial Virginia as established, but also flexible, as adaptable. A church that, while tied to the king himself or queen, relied upon the active labors of ordinary Virginians to function at the parish level. Yet, if we are to come to grips with the complexity of this distant society, we must also remember that the parish consisted of Black Virginians, as well as white ones. 18th century Virginia was a slave society. That is to say that its economy was based on enslaved labor, its laws codified and supported slavery, and slave ownership became the path to social prestige. The gentry who stood at the top of the social ladder enjoyed their wealth because they enslaved men and women to work for them. This unfree workforce in turn gave them the time and the wealth that they used to cultivate what they called gentility, the habits, the fashions, the other qualities that made someone a gentleman, the wealth to afford Georgian homes, the time to study the liberal arts, to devote to local and provincial politics. The slaveholding gentry were the model that other white Virginians aspired to be. The labor of unfree Black Virginians made the gentry and their role in Virginia society possible. So I threatened you all with numbers again, right? I said I gave you half the numbers, and now you're going to get the other half of them. While in 1690, enslaved people made up about 18% of the colony's population, by 1780, right? So we're in the kind of at the end of the American Revolution. It's 100 years later almost. By 1780, more than 40% of Virginians were enslaved, right? 40% of the population of the colony, and Virginia was one of, if not the largest colony in British America, were held as slaves in 1780. It is not possible to paint a representative picture of colonial Virginia without also discussing the African Americans who were enslaved in Virginia. I've tried to make a case that religion was intertwined with colonial law and government. It follows that religion also informed the evolution and the practice of race-based slavery in Virginia, given how religion and slavery were sewn into the fabric of the colony. In the colony's first century, the 1600s, slavery was less formal. It was one form of unfree labor along with other forms, such as indentured servitude, a labor system that saw English people, white English people, contract their labor to a master for several years in exchange for the voyage to America. So we have these two systems that are kind of coexisting in the 1600s, and they're, less well defined. In this formative period, we know that some people of African descent worked their way to freedom and became landowners. The classic example is Antonio Johnson, something their own descendants would be unable to do for centuries. Right? There's a limited window of time when that was possible. But by the 18th century, this had changed. Slavery became a more formal system, a lifelong condition, one passed from mother to child. And by 1705, Blackness, African ancestry, had become a marker for who was eligible for enslavement. Finally, the laws were clear that the enslaved were classified as chattel, as property, to be disposed of by their masters as those masters willed. As terrible as it is to imagine, I think that this is one of the most important things to remember when we try, however imperfectly, to imagine what the experience of slavery might have been like. And that is, enslaved people really were at the complete mercy of their enslavers, according to the law and to social convention. A big part of what made slavery so inhuman was the way that it degraded people by defining them as property, right? Property that could be abused physically, right? That could be beaten, that could be sexually assaulted, right? That could be sold apart from family members or children or spouses, without any sort of legal repercussions or even sort of social shame from one's neighbors. This was the shape of slavery at the dawn of the 1700s. What role did religion play in this evolution? Well, while Christianity and Islam were known in Africa by the 18th century and had been for more than 1,000 years, most of the men and women who were enslaved in West Africa subscribed to native African religious beliefs. These religious differences made it easier for Christian Europeans to justify enslaving Africans, right? Because there was that cultural difference. What's more, some Europeans argued that the very blackness of West Africans was the result of a biblical curse that was referenced in the Old Testament, right? That this was the curse of Ham laid upon one of Noah's sons. And as a result of that curse, Ham's ancestors had black skin and lived in Africa and were thus more eligible for enslavement. In this view, right, those Africans were condemned by God to be slaves. Blackness was associated with heathenism and whiteness with Christianity in the minds of white Virginians. Yet, as the number of Africans in Virginia continued to increase in the 1600s, so too did examples of white and black servants cooperating. Right? So too did examples of white and black servants helping one another to escape from abusive masters. In cases where whites and blacks formed intimate sexual relationships. Again, the definition of slavery, the definition of freedom, the definition of race, right, weren't yet fixed in the middle of the 1600s, in that kind of mid-century, those first decades. The association between race and slavery was constructed, was built by leading Virginians who passed legislation that declared in no uncertain terms what relationships were acceptable and who was eligible for enslavement and who was not. By 1662, the General Assembly declared, and I'm going to read this to you as you can see it as well. 1662, the General Assembly declared, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman should be a slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond, a slave, or free, only according to the condition of the mother. And if any Christian should commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. So we can kind of make a connection to those sort of morality laws, right, that the county court and the parish are sort of responsible for investigating and adjudicating. Note the conflation, right? Note the interchangeability in this between Englishman at the beginning of the law and Christian in the later part, each time in relation to someone described as a Negro, where their skin color was their blackness was the primary marker of identity. It is implied that these are exclusive, that an Englishman, white, is a Christian, right? That these are interchangeable. A black person, right, is not a Christian. The purpose of this law was twofold. First, to define in clear terms the legal status of children born of an interracial union. The child would share the condition of the mother. So a child born to an enslaved woman would be enslaved. Ancestry trumped baptism, or the whiteness of the father. Second, the law tried to further discourage interracial unions by fining whites who shared a bed with blacks. By 1705, by the way, the law specified that such fines would be paid to the church wardens of each parish for the relief of the poor. As sobering as this law is, when we consider the creation of slavery and race in America, it is also a reminder that slavery was not a natural state, nor inevitable. Slavery and the racism that developed to support slavery was built by men. Laws like this reveal that early Virginians, English and African, interacted with each other in ways that challenged emerging categories of white and black, free and slave, to the point where legislators felt compelled to define those differences in the law. As slavery became more formal and race-based in Virginia, and I'm not specifically trying to pick on Virginia, this is a process that we see unfold in similar ways, not necessarily identical ways, but in similar ways in the British Caribbean. It's something that had taken place in the Spanish American world, and every British colony, all the way up to places like New Hampshire, have laws supporting slavery by the American Revolution. So I'm discussing Virginia, but I am not. This is not necessarily exclusive to Virginia. As slavery became more formal and race-based in Virginia, tensions emerged between those interested in converting Africans and African Virginians to Christianity and those who feared that such conversions might free them. After all, it was religious differences that contributed to the othering of Africans to the point where they could be enslaved. Could someone be both a Christian and a slave in Virginia? In 1667, the General Assembly tried to assuage slaveholders' fears about the consequences of baptism. And their legislation read, whereas some doubts have risen whether children that are slaves by birth and by the charity and piety of their owners made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism should by virtue of their baptism be made free it is enacted and declared by this grand assembly and the authority thereof that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage, or his status as a slave, or freedom. That diverse masters, freed from this doubt, may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting children, though slaves, or shows of greater growth of capable, to be admitted to the sacrament. This statute made it clear that baptism, whatever its spiritual properties, whatever its spiritual promises, would not mean earthly emancipation in Virginia. Ancestry, as passed from mother to child, what we'll eventually start to talk about as race, and not whether they had been baptized, would serve as the key characteristic that identified someone as being enslaved. By the dawn of the 1700s, right, by the dawn of the 18th century, even if a lack of Christianity had helped justify the creation of American slavery, baptism lacked the power to end it in the eyes of the General Assembly. Further, the language of this law encouraged pious masters to convert their enslaved peoples without the fear that their piety endangered their worldly investment in enslaved labor.
David, just a quick question. While we're talking about mothers and slaves, and something that we really haven't approached that much, before we run out of time, I was kind of interested in the role of women in the church.
No, that's an excellent question. And this is, again, kind of an area where historians like Anne Braude and Catherine Breckus are really trying to shift what historians are looking at to talk more about women in the church. We know that throughout American history, more women have attended church services than men. Like historians have looked at this, and like in terms of adherence, again, like in terms of regular attendance and sort of taking part in the sacraments where they're offered, women do it more than men do. And yet, in most Christian sects, right, in most Christian denominations, in not just America, but in Europe and really the Christian world, women really lack any kind of formal authority. Shakerism and Quakerism provide some sort of challenges to that in the 18th and 19th century. But a lot of the roles that women played in Anglican Virginia tended to be more informal. We have legal records that talk about women going to court to try to insist that their husbands stop preventing them from going to church, right? We know that Anglican clergymen would offer a special sort of prayer, a churching for women who were near labor. And we know from diaries and letters, right, we have anecdotes of gentlewomen, right, of sort of elite women who were literate, of them having conversations with ministers who were, visiting their homes about scripture and sort of talking in a kind of a learned way about the Gospels. So we know that they're actively engaged with the church. We know that they, as much as we can measure piety, right, we know that they're displaying some of those traits. But they tend to have less sort of formal authority. I think one thing that we need to do more of would be to take a look at, even in informal ways, how women in Anglican parishes might have helped guide and support the parish in its initiatives and its efforts at poor relief and in other ways. So they are there, even if they're not counted in the vestry. They can be sextons, right? But Their roles are circumscribed, are kind of constrained, but they're active. Thank you. All right. So the relationship between enslaved Black Virginians and the parish evades generalizations. We know that many slaveholders resisted calls to baptize or to educate the enslaved for fear that it would encourage them to resist their bondage. In 1731, rumors swept across Virginia of a planned slave revolt, the worst fear of slave owners. Upon questioning several enslaved people about this uprising, they cited their conversion to Christianity as having inspired their intent to revolt. Even if the law insisted otherwise, enslaved people reached their own conclusions that slavery and Christianity were incompatible. Additionally, false rumors persisted among enslaved people that the King of England himself had ordered all baptized slaves freed, but that their enslavers in Virginia had suppressed the order. So as a result, missionaries from England and Anglican clergymen in Virginia really faced resistance from slaveholders when they attempted to minister to Black Virginians in a systematic way. Even if the laws ensured that baptism did not mean freedom for Black Virginians, it was clear that some enslaved people saw a message of liberation in the Gospels. It is challenging for us to uncover the personal religious beliefs of Black men and women in this period, in great part because the primary source record often leaves them out. Most of the written documents that we have were composed by whites and represent that perspective. Even where authors discuss slavery, we must recognize that what we read of the Black experience is filtered through a lens colored by racism. We know that despite the reluctance of slaveholders, some enslaved Virginians were catechized and baptized. We know that all enslaved Virginians, baptized or not, were parishioners because they lived within the parish. Even if many enslaved Black Virginians were not baptized, nor were they an empty spiritual vessel. Scholars have made a compelling case that African religious practices survived the harrowing Middle Passage from Africa to America. While formal, complete religious systems from Africa could not be reconstituted in the context of slavery, elements of various African traditions could be adapted and preserved. And this is kind of what I meant to show this picture with. Beliefs in a supreme creator, beliefs in various lesser gods, burial practices, and belief in an afterlife. In these, especially as Virginians imported more slaves from Africa, these beliefs were renewed, right, as those new arrivals sort of joined existing slave communities throughout the Tidewater. In these African spiritual beliefs, communities of enslaved people could feel solace, fellowship. The slaveholder's dilemma was that such beliefs fostered a collective African identity and might encourage resistance. Yet, slaveholders who sought to Christianize their enslaved people also risked exposing them to the stories of Hebrew slaves escaping Pharaoh. For those Black Virginians who attended Anglican services, there were clear spatial divisions between white and Black parishioners. Parishes built pews or sections in the back of the church or special galleries separate from free white parishioners. And in other cases, ministers often offered separate services for their enslaved congregants. Sunday worship at the church was in many ways a tableau of Virginia society, with white Virginians sitting by rank. In this arrangement, Black Virginians were clearly set apart in worship, mirroring the social order outside of the church walls. It is also difficult to generalize about the attitudes of Anglican clergy towards enslaved parishioners. Most clergy were British transplants in Virginia, answerable to the Bishop of London, but also aware of the power held by the vestrymen, who themselves were gentlemen slave owners. While there are examples of ministers empathizing with their Black parishioners, by and large, they expected deference. Sermons and religious instruction emphasize heavenly rewards for good behavior on earth and hellfire for those who were insolent or rebellious. This was not a version of the Gospels meant to inspire rebellion, but one that largely aligned with what slaveholding elites, who were also often vestrymen, wanted. There is no formal record of how many Black Virginians were communicants, but anecdotes suggest very few. There were a few token efforts to educate among the enslaved in the decades before the Revolution, but none in a systematic way. A few schools were opened for Black children in the colony in the 1760s, including actually one school here in Fredericksburg, but they enjoyed little local support beyond the missionary organizations that founded them. Masters who enrolled young Black children did so only until they learned enough of letters to be useful in tasks that involved reading. The labor needs of slave owners always outweighed any concern that Black boys and girls gain an education. Enslaved peoples provided the labor that constructed churches, and as tithables, their masters paid taxes upon them that helped support the parish financially. In turn, enslaved men and women received little in the way of material and spiritual support from their parishes. Even in baptism, they remained the property of their owners in the eyes of the law. Here too, the church fit itself to the conditions in Virginia, as it had adapted itself to support slavery, making Christianity palatable to slave owners. One of the last sort of topics that I'd like to broach is a little bit about change. And so we'll talk a little bit about the rise of evangelicalism and dissent in Virginia on the eve of the American Revolution. And then I'll conclude by just talking a little bit about what the American Revolution meant for the religious establishment and the church in Virginia. Dissenting Protestants, Presbyterians, Quakers, Baptists, and more, had lived in Virginia throughout the 18th century as parishioners of the established church. Even as they subscribed to different doctrines, they paid their parish assessments and honored the laws, attending church within the required frequency, and seeking Anglican clergy when they wished to be married. There are even a few examples of dissenters on the vestry of Anglican churches, duly discharging their duties to care for the maintenance of a parish they belong to, even if their own beliefs lay elsewhere. For much of the century, the religious establishment of Virginia appeared to be relatively tolerant of dissenters who respected the status quo. Church wardens were not knocking down the doors of suspected Quakers. Presbyterians did not find themselves run out of town. Dissenters did, however, face the additional burden of raising additional funds for their own churches and their own clergy voluntarily, on top of paying parish assessments to their Anglican parish. In fact, the General Assembly and the royal governors of Virginia encouraged the settlement of dissenting Protestants when it suited the needs of the colony. The namesake of Germanna Community College, for example, was of course a group of German Protestants who were settled in Virginia under the reign of Queen Anne, right? At the time, right, they were settled on the Rapidan River by Governor Alexander Spotswood, And at that time, they were planted on really what was the western fringe of the British Empire, the frontier. To encourage their settlement, the Germans were granted a 7-year exception to paying assessments to the Church of England, right? So this is a kind of a bonus, right? It's an incentive to have them settle out there. And they were given their own parish, named St. George's, rather than be folded into the existing open-ended parish that was already there. In 1720, as the Reverend said, the Assembly created Spotsylvania and Brunswick counties and reconstituted St. George's Parish as a regular Anglican parish overlaid on top of Spotsylvania and Brunswick County. To further encourage European Protestants to settle in those new counties, the Assembly again exempted dissenting Protestants, dissenting European Protestants from paying parish taxes for 10 years if they could provide for and fund a minister of their own. Why do this? Why make these exceptions? It is important to remember that this first half of the 18th century saw a series of imperial wars fought between Britain and France for territory in North America. The religious differences between these empires helped fuel these conflicts. Catholic missionaries had met with some success in converting the native peoples of French America. And French and Spanish settlements had established the Roman Catholic faith in ways similar to that as the Anglican Church was established in British colonies. For governors such as Alexander Spotswood, pictured here, William Gooch, settling Protestants on the western frontier of Virginia was imperative because it provided a buffer, right? A religious, but also a military kind of buffer against the French and French allied Indians, even if those settlers were dissenters instead of Anglicans. Here again, we see that the political religious establishment of Anglican Virginia could be flexible, right? It could be adaptive, not just to the landscape of the colony, but in this case to larger imperial concerns, right? To defeating the hated French rival, right? The Pope and the Pope. While the church could accommodate dissenters who otherwise complied with the demands of the parish system, evangelicals tested the limits of this tolerance. Over the course of the 18th century, a series of religious revivals in Britain and British America gave birth to evangelical Christianity. Evangelicalism would grow to encompass many different sects and churches, as well as energize smaller groups within larger churches. For our purposes, though, I would like to highlight just some of the common attributes of evangelicalism that cut across some of these denominational differences. First, evangelicals emphasized the importance of a sudden and powerfully emotional conversion experience. This was often a deeply individual event, likened to being born again or awakened to their own sinfulness and to their dependence on God's grace for salvation. While conversion in the Catholic and Anglican tradition involved education and time, right, the completion of sacramental rites, in evangelical sects, conversion was often internal, personal, and in some cases affected in a moment, instantaneously. Second, evangelicals emphasize the importance of Scripture in revealing religious truth, placing less emphasis on liturgy, less emphasis on religious institutions. In fact, more radical evangelical ministers accused many clergy as being unconverted, effectively questioning the legitimacy of churches that had not embraced their manner of worship. Many early Americans found in evangelical Christianity a source of great comfort and reassurance in their faith journeys. However, the rise of evangelicalism was also a divisive event splintered congregations and spurred change. In Virginia, where religious and civil authority were married, evangelicals' insistence on making individual choices about the terms of their worship presented not merely a religious controversy, but a social challenge, right? Beginning in the 1740s, itinerant evangelical preachers traveled to Virginia and preached, drawing believers to their religious meetings. The arrival of the separate Baptists provided a special challenge in the 1760s, as they refused to conform to many of the legal requirements that dissenting sects had in the past, right? Paying a tax, attending church, getting an Anglican priest to marry them. Most dramatically, they rejected the lifestyle of the gentry, the elites whose lifestyle reflected their wealth and authority. Baptists criticized drinking, they criticized gambling and displays of wealth, and sought to create religious communities of equals. They were, in the words of historian Rhys Isaac, a counterculture. For Anglican gentlemen who enjoyed these vices and were keenly aware of their position on the social ladder, Baptists' call for a personal reformation, in addition to their rejection of the established church, was an unwelcome affront. By 1771, not only had concerned Anglicans leveled attacks on separate Baptists in the newspapers, but there were also a number of incidents where gentlemen had physically assaulted Baptist ministers, beating them in public and disrupting their meetings. Particularly vexing was the fact that Baptists welcomed enslaved Virginians into their communities, calling them brother and sister. Evangelical Christianity took root within enslaved communities more quickly, in great part because of evangelicalism's emphasis on spiritual equality and its use of oral communication to spread rather than written texts. Right? It's more accessible. Evangelical religious expression was also often deeply emotional and emphasized feeling over learning, hearkening back in some respects to African religious traditions, and as a result were more accessible than religious education via texts. In these revivals, many enslaved people found a spiritual equality with other believers that they could not find within the established Anglican Church. Few 18th century evangelicals, including George Whitefield, one of the most famous, were willing to challenge slavery as an institution. But nonetheless, these factors enabled enslaved Virginians to access this brand of Christianity more readily, and in time, fashion their own traditions that drew upon African precedents in this evangelical tradition. The last topic that I'd like to present to you this evening really has to do with the American Revolution. As these religious contests unfolded, so too did tensions between the colonies and Great Britain give way to confrontation and ultimately war. Yet the American Revolution was more than just the war for independence. While 2/5 of the population of the 13 colonies directly engaged in revolt against royal authority, they also deliberately, in some cases, and quite unintentionally in others, constructed an engine for social change in America. While these changes often came very slowly, in the case of religion, people had not long to wait. The ideas of individual rights, limited government, and the notion that people should have a voice in their laws, what would have been called liberalism in the 18th century, were profoundly important for the future of religion in America. Today, the First Amendment to the Constitution, for many of us, represents that sort of promise of religious liberty. And really what the First Amendment promises is kind of two things. One, it ensures free exercise of religion, right, arguing that it insists that the federal government won't allow free exercise to be prohibited, right? It won't interfere with people worshiping as they want. And it also promises that the national government will not establish a church, right? So there will never be a Church of the United States of America, right? I assume that the vestments would have the American flag somehow integrated into them. This and the other amendments that made up the Bill of Rights were added to an already written constitution as part of a settlement between supporters and critics of the Constitution of 1787. So-called anti-federalists, including Virginians like George Mason and Patrick Henry, were fearful that the Constitution lacked explicit protections for citizens against an empowered central government. The inclusion of the Bill of Rights, including these religious clauses in the First Amendment, won over enough anti-federalists to secure ratification of the Constitution and reshape the nature of the American Union. Most of us think of the First Amendment when we think of the protection of religious liberty in America, but it's important to realize that the language of the First Amendment had its origins in years of experimentation at the state level. In June 1776, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, right, asserted that religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. And therefore, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of their conscience, and that it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. This was a bold statement, claiming that people should not be coerced into worshiping in a certain way, and insisting that individual reason and conscience would henceforth guide individuals in their manner of worship. The primary author, George Mason, offered a bold challenge to more than a century and a half of established church precedent. But this was not the first or even the final word on the matter. The wording that would be included on the screen before you in that Virginia Declaration of Rights was part of a larger and longer debate among leading Virginians about what religious freedom ought to look like. In fact, an earlier draft of the Declaration offered an even more full-throated call for religious liberty. So what I've done here is I've put them on the screen, comparing them for you, okay? What's on the right is the version that we just read, what you just looked at. And I've highlighted in yellow the section that is different, right? What you see on the left is Mason's original wording that was changed in committee, right? Changed in debate before it was put out to the world. And I'm just going to read that highlighted section in the original draft, that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, unpunished and unrestrained by the magistrate, unless, under color of religion, any man disturbeth the peace, the happiness, or the safety of society. So there's some differences here. Here, James Madison, right, another sort of famous constitutionalist and sort of Virginia founder, objected specifically to the use of the word toleration, right? He doesn't like the use of the word toleration in this original draft, arguing that it suggested that government could choose at its pleasure to withdraw the right of free exercise. For Madison, the ability to worship according to conscience was an essential, inalienable right. Madison won that argument, but Madison even went further in his suggestions and suggested language that would end any special privilege for one church or another in the state. In short, Madison took aim at the idea of an established church at all in Virginia, where Mason had left it in place, right? He's speaking for free exercise, but not speaking against establishment. This threat to the Anglican Church's place went too far for others and was not included in Virginia's state constitution. So as Virginians wrestled with what their new Republican form of government would look like, they saw two issues related to religious liberties. First, free exercise, the ability of people to make a decision on how to worship. And second, the place of their established church with its long-standing relationship with local and provincial government and its tax support, right? What will the fate of these two elements of religion be? This debate continued for 10 years over the course of the Revolutionary War and into the first years of independence. Petitions from dissenters reached the General Assembly, and they invoked the language of the Declaration of Rights, calling for an end to the privileges of the Anglican Church. Slowly, the Virginia legislature weakened the Anglican establishment by degrees. In 1784, Patrick Henry proposed a tax for what he called a multiple establishment, where taxpayers would specify which church would receive the payment, right? So there would still be an established church, a tax-supported church, but effectively you'd be able to indicate whether it would go to the Methodists or the Anglicans or even the Catholics. From the perspective of Henry and others, including George Washington, this would permit people choice, right? They wouldn't send their dollars to a church they didn't believe in, but it would also ensure that public funds would support public morality, acknowledging a centuries-old maxim that the church represented a pillar of public order. Henry and other supporters of this bill were opposed by Madison, who led legislators in promoting Thomas Jefferson's Statute for Religious Freedom, which did away with any religious establishment. Both factions championed religious liberty, but they disagreed about its formulation. Finally, in January of 1786, almost a decade since Virginia's Declaration of Rights linked the Revolution with religious liberty, Jefferson's bill passed the legislature. Virginia, for the first time, had no established church, not the Anglican Church, nor the multiple establishment favored by Henry. While many, for good reason, celebrate Jefferson's statute, it is worth remembering that defining religious liberty in Virginia was not the work of any one person, that it involved debate and unfolded over the course of years. But the famed wall of separation between church and state was not quite there either. Evangelicals joined with Anglicans, now members of the Protestant Episcopal Church, in supporting laws that reflected their shared Christian morality after disestablishment. So they're still like petitioning the legislature to make laws that reflect their ethic, such as laws that would protect the Sabbath, right, and make work illegal on Sundays. Yet at the same time, evangelical groups in Virginia petitioned the General Assembly to sell off glebe lands that had been entrusted to parishes. By the beginning of the 19th century, despite a series of legal challenges in state and federal court, Episcopalians had lost the fight to retain their parish glebes. With the death or resignation of a minister, the state would sell off glebe lands, ending another vestige of Anglicanism's colonial establishment. Episcopalians thus entered the first full century of the American experiment, once again adapting to a new landscape, much as colonial Anglicans had centuries before. While the physical geography of Virginia remained the same, the religious topography had changed. Parishes would now compete for congregants and the financial support with an increasing multitude of denominations and sects, each with their own claim to legitimacy. As historian Lincoln Mullen has emphasized, choice became a defining feature of American religion. Americans shopped in a new marketplace of religion in the early republic, a culture where individuals were free to make decisions about which religion fit their sensibilities the best. Here too, we see that the church was tied to social and cultural changes. Americans would have to figure out how religion and democracy fit together, much as English transplants had adapted their faith to the colonies centuries before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was an outstanding presentation, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. We did get a couple questions in. There was one that I wanted to run by you, give you a chance to catch your breath. But we had a member of the audience who was wondering why there wasn't an Episcopal presence in the colonies, why the Church of England didn't send a bishop over.
It's a great question. And there's, I think, some debate about it among historians. One factor is that there really isn't a plan for the colonies. Like, it's not like King James I in 1607 has like a roadmap for how the colonies are going to sort of be constructed over 150 years. The colonies sort of develop in kind of a patchwork manner. And so I think a combination of the attention of the Anglican Church perhaps being devoted elsewhere is one aspect of that. Another is that actually in the 1760s, there is some murmuring in New England, or at least New York, among Anglicans to invite a bishop to America, to try to really kind of push to make that happen. And there's actually a great deal of pushback against that, not only from dissenting Christians, dissenting Protestants, who, in many ways are dissenters because they think bishops are still too Catholic, but the General Assembly of Virginia and other sort of legislative bodies often took on part of the role of a bishop. And so there's perhaps a jealousy that much as they're kind of fighting a battle with British Parliament over where the authority for taxation lies, that if they invite an Anglican bishop, they might lose some control over faith as well.
And there was one more question about the worship obligations and the mandatory attendance.
Yeah.
That you mentioned the rigors of travel, like how long it would take to get from home to church or chapel, and we were just wondering if how the authorities figured that distance in terms of mandating attendance.
That's actually a really interesting question, and I'm not sure that I have a specific answer to it. I think the attendance law in giving people 2 months earlier in the 18th century and then 1 month later in the 18th century is an attempt to add flexibility, right? To acknowledge that journey might take several hours depending on where they live in relation to the nearest chapel. And I suspect that, and again, this is an educated guess, I haven't done the research specifically, but I would be interested to see if the reason why the attendance requirement became a little tighter, right, went from 8 weeks to 4 weeks later in the 18th century, might be because more churches had been constructed, right? So it was getting easier for people to get there. I do know, like in a related fashion, Kentucky, right? Anything I can do to bring things back to Kentucky. But Kentucky has over 90 counties, and it has so many counties because they wanted to make sure that everyone could get to the courthouse in about a day's walk or a day's horse ride. So, there are magistrates thinking about those kinds of things.
And one last question for you, that politics in the pulpit have always been an interesting question in American history. How politically involved were the churches at the time of the Revolution?
That's an excellent question. They absolutely were involved. The American Revolution itself is really more of I want to phrase this carefully, right? I mean, it's triggered by political events more than religious events, really. But as that question is framed, ministers and clergy across the 13 colonies use their pulpit to encourage people to either support the cause, right? Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God, right? But also in some cases to condemn, the revolution, right? I mean, there are obviously not every Anglican is a loyalist, but there are Anglican ministers from Britain who feel a deep connection to the Church of England and to their king, and use that pulpit to speak out for loyalism, as well as for the revolution. And we see the same thing in the early national period. I mean, people are debating the Constitution, not just in taverns, but in churches.
That is great, David. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your evening with us and for all of the work that you obviously put into the presentation. We greatly appreciate it, and we would love to have you back when you can actually come and see us in person, and when you can talk with us inside our beautiful historic structure. And before I toss it back to Joe, I do just want to put in a plug that David's appearance tonight is just the first of the series, and we are very fortunate to have two more very able local historians to talk about different periods of the world of St. George's as it progresses through 300 years. We have our friend John Hennessy from the National Park Service, the Fredericksburg National Battlefield, who's going to talk to us about the church during the tumult of the Civil War, and Professor Aaron Devlin from the University of Mary Washington, who is an expert on the 60s, the Civil Rights Movement, is going to talk about that troubled and dynamic time. And we're in a bit of a state of flux with the pandemic, but we will, as soon as we can, post the official dates for those talks. And with that, Joe, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, David. David, there was a couple other questions that might be able to be answered quickly that popped up just toward the end here.
Sure.
One was, how do you think religious freedoms would look today if Madison hadn't insisted on the revisions?
It's an interesting question. I think one thing that might inform a guess about that is that while the First Amendment to the Constitution forbid a national religious establishment, state religious establishments continued into the 1830s. So while the federal government would, never try to tell people how they had to worship, Virginia was, I believe, the first to dispense with it. And then you have Massachusetts, which is, maybe not a big surprise. Massachusetts is the last state to dispense with a tax-supported church. So a lot of them go kind of half measure. I mean, a lot of them will open the doors to free exercise of religion, right? They're no longer going to kick Quakers out of their towns, but they still require residents to pay a tax to support their favored church. And people, especially in New England, kind of that's the status quo, really for the first 40 years of the Union. So, I would imagine things might look something like that, a kind of blend of government established, government support for some sort of religious institution without kind of demanding that people attended it.
And there was one other question, you can't get by without having a question about George Washington when in Fredericksburg area, about the relationship between St. George Washington and St. George's. You may not know a whole lot about that. I can fill in a few gaps, but maybe you know something.
And you're right. I have to confess that is a specific area where I'm a little weaker. My sense is that Mary Washington, his mother, was a parishioner at St. George's. So I find it hard to believe that there isn't some sort of relationship, between or familiarity with Washington and St. George's. And Washington spent much of his boyhood right down in this area. So right. This would have been the parish where he was exposed and sort of grew into manhood within Christianity.
That's right.
but I would defer to you.
Well,
on
and,
anything
and
more.
I defer to our historians who've put together the information, I have a cheat sheet. So, uh, George Washington was tutored by the rector of St. George's, Reverend Marie, Marye, and so it is thought that that George was influenced by Reverend Marie, and the other. We sort of, St. George's is famous for having relatives of famous people as a part of our parish. So while George Washington probably did attend worship at St. George's, he was not a member of the parish. They lived across the river, so it was a different parish actually where they lived, but it was closer. It was probably the closest one. But when his mother moved into town, she did become a member. George Washington's brother-in-law, Fielding Lewis,
Right.
And who was Fielding Lewis, sort of the Kenmore estate up on Washington Avenue in Fredericksburg, was a member of the vestry in 1753. George Washington's brother, Charles Washington, was on the vestry in 1766. So those are just a few little tidbits about George Washington and St. George's.
Oh, always nice to bring it back to George.
Well, I echo, and I'm just sort of checking out the chat and the Q&A, and I don't see any other questions. I see lots of affirmations and thanks, and so the audience is, although they can't applaud visibly, they are applauding in the chat and giving you their appreciation for what a rich discussion tonight. And we thank you very much. And for those of you who are, keep an eye on our 300th anniversary offerings, because the St. George's specific history will be a topic of forums in the next year, Sunday morning forums that we'll be doing at different points. And so we'll be sharing more about that as we go. This was wonderful to have this greater context about the church in general and how St. George's fits in, that St. George's would be a part of.
Well, I was honored to be a part of it. So thank you all for your hospitality.
Well, let us go forth with just a word of prayer. The Lord be with you again. Let us pray. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night. Give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous. And for your love's sake. Amen. Well, again, we thank you, and thank you everyone who joined in tonight. I think at the top we had about 112 or 13 participants. Wonderful to have such a turnout. Again, if you can make a donation to St. George's in support of our 300th anniversary activities, we would welcome that, and we will look forward to sharing more as we can. And in the meantime, take care and have a wonderful evening. Peace be with you.